Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, here's the thing about Michael Korvac, and here's the thing that people usually tend to either not know or tend to forget. So Michael Korvac and the Corvax Saga that took place in the Avengers was not really designed to be that way, right? It was essentially a last-minute decision made by Marvel Comics. And the reason why is in 1975, in Giant Size Defenders #3, there was a story called Games Godlings Play, I think is what it was called. And it was basically the Defenders themselves. Now, at the time, the team was composed of Doctor Strange, Nighthawk, who was actually a character from Squadron Sinister, who the Defenders had previously defeated, and then in turn, Nighthawk was brought over to the Defenders themselves, as well as the Incredible Hulk, Daredevil, I think. He was involved in the story. I don't remember if he was part of the team, Valkyrie, and so on. But the idea here was to write this story and just have like the Defenders facing off against various villains that were brought in by the Grandmaster. And the notion behind this was that if the Defenders lost, then the Earth would be enslaved. If the Defenders won, then the Earth would go free. And so, of course, the Defenders won. And so as a result of that, during that story, Michael Korvac was introduced as just a guy who was born in the year 2977. And that was it. He was just kind of designed to be there for the sake of the story as just a villain created by Steve Gerber in order to tell the Defender's tale, and then that was it. The problem with this is that by the time you got around to 1977 with Thor Annual #6, you had Len Wein and you had Roger Stern. And these two guys, between the two of them, especially coming off the tails of Giant Size X-Men #1, Len Wein was supremely popular. Now, of course, he had like created Wolverine and things like that, and he had a lot of writing under his belt, but Giant Size X-Men #1, I think, was really the story that kind of blew him up. But the idea behind this was that at the time, Marvel had this comic called Marvel Presents, right? And this was basically an anthology series of books, right? So like the old school Action Comics, where basically it's a comic book that has a whole bunch of different stories in it. So you had like issue #1 back in 1975, and I think it was in October of 1975, brought in Ulysses Bloodstone. So you had John Warner who wrote it, you had Steve Gerber who wrote it, but at the time, really in the later half of 1977, Roger Stern was writing it. And so with Marvel Presents at that point in time, you had the Guardians of the Galaxy, really the Guardians 3000 more or less is what they were, who were brought in and who were essentially kind of an ongoing theme in the Marvel Presents stories, and were relatively popular. I mean, they weren't huge. I mean, they weren't super popular. I mean, they were created by Archie Goodwin, Len Wein, and Marv Wolfman. Ultimately, they were canceled after 12 issues, so it wasn't really all that popular. They were relegated to Marvel Presents. But Roger Stern wanted to take the character of Michael Korvac, who we thought was interesting and who we could do something with, and then throw him into the comic, but the issue was that it was canceled before we could do anything with it. And so following that, you ended up having like the Avengers stories as they were being done by Len Wein at the time, I think. And so the goal was to basically take Michael Korvac, throw him into the Avengers stories, and then we got the Corvax Saga. And so you didn't really get much of an origin story until you got to the Corvax Saga, right? I mean, it started in Thor Annual #6, but basically it ended up extending out into the Avengers between issues 167, 168, and then 170 to 177. I want to say 169 was an interim story, but essentially it's just the Corvax Saga, which was written by Jim Shooter and David Michelinie, and so it proved to be one of the most popular stories that Marvel had, right? Like the Corvax Saga set the stage for Secret Wars 1984. For those of you guys who don't know, like it's a pretty significant event. But the way this played out was Michael Korvac was a guy from the 31st century or the 30th century or whatever. He was from the year 2900, a little after 3000 to be precise. And essentially at that point in time, like Earth and really like the Sol system had been conquered by the Badoon. And so the result of this is that it was a pretty harsh kind of militaristic environment, but Michael Korvac was effectively like an enslaved human. And the result was that during his job, he fell asleep, and what they ended up doing was basically blending his physical body with computer technology, essentially turning him into a cyborg. And so what this did is it allowed him to essentially analyze everything he came across, right? Like any and all information could be analyzed by him, and in turn he could, achieve a multitude of different goals. This eventually led to him showing up in the modern day and then analyzing the ship of Galactus, which basically granted him the power cosmic in the process. And as a result, he essentially started to go insane. Well, maybe insane is not really the right word. Maybe that's really not the right phrase here. Technically speaking, he was kind of time displaced, right? Like in the Corvax Saga, the way that Jim Shooter and them kind of got around and sort of incorporated what Roger Stern and Len Wein did is they came back and they said, okay, so like what was going on at the time was that the Michael Korvac that we saw in the original Defenders, Giant Size Defenders #3 story was one who was yanked through time by the Grandmaster to engage in that fight, right? And so after he was defeated, I think he went back to his own time, but regardless, he ended up showing up in the Earth 616 universe, right? In the main Marvel universe. And that's when he scanned Galactus' ship and basically went forward and had the power cosmic. But what he ended up doing was meeting the daughter of the Collector, a woman by the name of Karina, and the two of them actually fell in love. Now, in the Guardians of the Galaxy movie, you guys would recognize Karina really in Guardians 2 as the chick who grabbed the Power Stone. I don't really know what the relationship is between her and Collector, and the Guardians of the Galaxy film is never really explored. She seems like more of an office assistant than anything else, but regardless, during the Corvax Saga, the two of them actually end up falling in love, and she starts to sort of sympathize with him, and it creates kind of a softer side. But ultimately, this ends up with all the various superheroes facing off against Korvac, who's wielding this power of Galactus, and in turn just starts like killing everybody, right? I mean, like, it seems like there's no real way to stop him. Ultimately, what ends up happening after killing like a multitude of different heroes is he basically reverses everything he'd done after he realizes that Karina doesn't really sympathize with him anymore, that she doesn't really like him anymore, and ultimately sacrifices his own life by just kind of dispersing his essence across the cosmos and just kind of going out with a big bang. It was the only real way to end the story, right? I mean, it's, you know, back in then it was common practice for writers to write themselves into a corner and then try to find some way to end it. Jim Shooter was especially bad about that. But what it did is it basically kind of set in motion this idea that like the power cosmic could be stolen if a being was of sufficient power or had the technological means to access it. And so when you take that and you kind of go forward, this sort of hackneyed explanation about about Michael Korvac, I feel like we should do a full-on Michael Korvac explained video, right? So we can cover like more stuff in detail. But when you look at that for what it is, what you're talking about is somebody who stole the power of Galactus, or at least who copied the power of Galactus and then went forward as a villain, right? So it really kind of speaks for itself. And it's one of the reasons why I kind of held off on, you know, too powerful for Marvel movies, Michael Korvac, because it would be like, what if Galactus became a bad guy with like all human intent and emotion and ended up fighting all the superheroes? He would kill them all. Like they would all be totally obliterated. I mean, at the end of the day, Michael Korvac ended his own life. He wasn't defeated by anybody in particular because he was just so vastly powerful. With someone like that, you can't really incorporate them into the Marvel Cinematic Universe because what it does is it elevates them to a level of power that's so extreme that there's no feasible way for them to lose, right? There's no real way that they can be defeated. It's the Matthew Malloy concept. Matthew Malloy was a character who was introduced by Brian Michael Bendis, and he was astronomically powerful, so powerful that he couldn't be stopped, and the only way to really stop him was to travel into the past and stop him from being born. Now that was Brian Michael Bendis being Bendis and just kind of hand waving away, and that's kind of what Bendis does. But with regards to, again, putting Michael Korvac in the MCU, again, it speaks for itself. You know, somebody walking around with what's essentially omnipotence, right? Like an insane amount of power, you know, the ability to like create, and like there's one point where he fights Starhawk and he actually kills Starhawk, he disintegrates him and then reconstitutes him and takes Starhawk's ability away to recognize Michael Korvac, right? There's one point where Michael Korvac restructures his entire body to appear like a perfect human. I mean, there's all these things, like in terms of how he believes he should appear. There's all these crazy displays of power that you see when it comes to his character. And so somebody with the ability to create worlds and destroy worlds, to resurrect people from the dead, you know, with all this kind of stuff, essentially the power of like cosmic entities, you can't really put him in the MCU. Now, having said that, and I probably should backtrack there, you could, but it would require invoking characters that haven't really been invoked before. Michael Korvac was equal to Galactus in power, and that was really kind of it. But there are other characters out there who are far more powerful or equal to Galactus in power, right? So you could do the Corvax Saga proper, but you would have to have introduced characters like the Molecule Man Owen Reese. You would have to have introduced characters like Franklin Richards. The Celestials could do it, assuming the Celestials in the movies are on par with their versions of the comics. You'd have to have cosmic entities, right? So like Eternity, Infinity, the Living Tribunal may be introduced. At that point, you're talking about more power than you need to defeat Michael Korvac. I mean, just a really strong Earth-based character could do it, right? So like the Molecule Man, right? I mean, before his power was reduced, he fought the Beyonder and they created like shockwaves throughout the entire multiverse because their battle was so intense. So you would have to have some pretty powerful characters in there, some pretty heavy hitters to introduce Michael Korvac into the MCU. As it stands right now, nobody's powerful enough. Either that or you're talking about Michael Korvac showing up and basically taking what was equivalent to the power of Thanos and then using that going forward. But it defeats the entire purpose of the Korvac Saga, right? I mean, the purpose of the Korvac Saga was basically a human who is now a cyborg getting the power of essentially one of the most powerful beings in existence, and then in turn going forward and just, you know, kind of becoming a villain. And it was really more of like a character tale, right? The rise and fall of Michael Korvac. So again, it could work, but you would need a lot of heavy hitters in order to pull that story off, because the reality is that it wouldn't really be believable that what will be the new Avengers, the Avengers without Spider-Man, which good luck selling that. But essentially you'd have like the new Avengers and nobody would believe it if they somehow successfully defeated this guy, right? Because there's no Tony Stark to help them think their way out. There's no Captain America, no Steve Rogers to rally them together. Maybe Falcon can do it. We don't know enough about his character or how his character is going to evolve to know what kind of role he's going to play. Jane Foster would be a cool heavy hitter, but she's not powerful enough to stop Michael Korvac. Captain Marvel certainly isn't. I mean, there's really no one there who could go on par and defeat this guy. What it would ultimately boil down to is some entity outside of the main characters of the film, the Avengers basically, or even the X-Men, defeating Michael Korvac. You know, it would basically be, these guys can't do it on their own. Let's grab something else instead. Now, it would be a cool way to introduce cosmic entities, to present present Michael Korvac in such a way to where he is a far more dire threat than Thanos, I think would actually be pretty cool. I would like to believe in the future of the MCU, Thanos was not where it peaked, right? He's not like the top villain we're ever gonna see, and like everybody's just second to him after that. You know, that would kind of suck. Like, I'd want to see the villains get more and more powerful and more dangerous, right? Like Dragon Ball villains, basically. You know, but it's kind of cool. Like, it's interesting insofar as his character and what he can do, but as far as the Marvel Cinematic Universe goes, he's just too powerful for it. You know, in its current form, there's no way it would work. You know, it would take cosmic entities or some beings of divine power in order to basically take him out. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.